Hi there, and welcome back to another video. So in the previous video, I went over different case sizes and how you can use different case size plot files to optimize your total hard drive space. Now in this video, I'm going to go over choosing a dedicated SSD to plot on. Now why would you want a dedicated SSD? Well, for one thing, it really allows you to plot in parallel. Now technically you can plot in parallel with a standard hard drive, but it will be extremely slow and you really won't plot any faster. But there are a lot of questions to take in consideration when choosing an SSD, and if you're not very familiar with them, it can be quite daunting and overwhelming. So if we go to the SSD endurance page on the Chia GitHub, I'll link this into the description, and you kind of look at the list that they got here for you so that you can compare them all. Well, you know, that's nice that they have this list, but it's incredibly daunting. You know, it's a bit overwhelming, and how do you know which one's right for your machine? Now, I broke this down into 5 questions that you really need to ask yourself. The first one being capacity. So like, how big do you want the SSD to be? And you really are going to derive this from your current hardware. Now, this video assumes that you're using a machine that you already have built and you're not really building out a machine. If you do want a video like that, I'm sure another YouTuber has a great video, but this is for people looking to get an SSD for their current hardware. Now, whenever you're looking at it, you're going to look at your CPU and your RAM, and from there you can see which one is your bottleneck, which one is going to limit the number of parallel plots that you can do. So if you decide that your maximum is 3 parallel plots, well, you're going to get a 1 terabyte SSD, and I'll explain how we get that number in a little bit. So, and then we'll go through these one by one. So endurance, how long will the SSD last? You know, form factor, will it fit on your motherboard? Interface, and the speed is the last choice. So let's go ahead and just jump into it. So, you know, let's go back to the add a plot page and let's choose advanced option. So let's see the RAM and the CPU requirements. So and you really want to keep these default. There's really no reason to change them at this point. So for a K32, which is going to be the most common plot that you're going to apply, you're going to need about 3.4 megabytes or gigabytes of RAM. Well, how do you figure out how much RAM your system has? Well, you can type out system information and then go to total physical memory, and then you can divide this by, let's make it easy, divide it by 4, you know, and essentially based on my system or my RAM capacity, I could do 8 parallel plots. Well, that's great, but now let's take in consideration the number of threads. So you really do want to leave this at 2 as well. And then how do you calculate how much CPU you can plot with? Well, you're going to have to look at how many threads your CPU has. Well, how can you do this? Well, if you open up PowerShell and then you type out git sim instance and then do win32 processor and then do a little pike or vertical bar and then do FL and asterisk. And then here we can get the number of threads our processor has. So my processor has 6 thread count. So you're going to want to divide this by 2, and that equals 3 parallel plots. So even though I have enough RAM for 8, my CPU will only allow me for 3. So that's my bottleneck. So that's how we derive the capacity, you know, that for the SSD. Now yours might be different. Yours might be 4, in which case a 1 terabyte SSD might not be enough. Now, how do we calculate this? Well, we have to look at the temporary space that each plot requires when we're creating them. So for a K32, it requires 240 gigabytes of space for each plot. So you times that by 3, you get about 720 gigabytes worth of space that's required to plot 3 at the same time. So that will fit on a 1 terabyte hard drive or SSD. So that's how we get that number. So, you know, if yours is 4, well, you times this number by 4. So you would take 239 times 4, and you're at 956. However, this really would not be enough for a 1 terabyte because you can see that this is GIB, where hard drives are measured in GB, and so this would be actually not enough. And I'll get into that in a little bit as well. Actually, let's go ahead and look why this would not be enough. So if you go back to the SSD endurance page, go ahead and click on this link, buying SSD for Chia. Now, I do recommend reading both of these pages, especially this one, to get a better understanding. However, they do have a nice little chart here. So here we can see that the temp space GIB is 239 like we saw in the GUI. However, in GB, which is what SSD measure their capacity with, is 256. Now you can quickly do the math for this, times it by 4, and you can see that's over 1 terabyte. So 1 terabyte would not be enough for 4 parallel plots. Okay, so now that we have this figured out, and I did write a custom function as well. So let's go ahead and clear the screen to quickly figure out, your current hardware's capacity for parallel plotting. So let's go ahead and just copy the function into PowerShell. And now this will be in my PS Chia plotter module. So you can do git Chia max parallel plot count. And here it kind of lists out everything. So it does the default of 2 threads, the default buffer of 3398, and then it tells you the max parallel plot. So for, again, my machine, it says 3. Then it kind of just lists out the information of your CPU and your RAM, and it tells you where your bottleneck is. So if it's your RAM, you might be able to add another couple of RAM sticks and get this up. And then also gives you a suggested capacity. So for me, it's 1 terabyte. All right, so now that we have the capacity figured out, that's good. Now we can move on to the endurance. Now, why do we talk about endurance with SSDs? And especially with Chia? Well, this is because SSDs don't last forever, and Chia actually writes a lot whenever it's creating plot files. So here we can see that it tells us that it writes about 1.6 terabytes worth of data for every plot file. Now, SSDs are measured based on how many terabytes they can write in their lifetime. So a lot of consumer-grade SSDs are about 600 terabytes. So how can you figure out how many plots you can write with the SSD? Well, you would take this number right here, the TPW, which stands for terabytes written, and let's go ahead and find one that I bought. So I bought the Samsung 970 EVO. Now, I don't suggest buying this one particularly, because I made some mistakes, but it's not a bad one either. So let's take 600, right? And let's open up our calculator, and we'll just do 600 divided by 1.6. And we get 375 plots. Well, how much is that? I mean, that's about, let's say, divided by 10. It's about 37 terabytes worth of space, So if you're only plotting, let's say, 18 terabytes, well, you're good. This actually will work for you. However, there are more factors to take in consideration. But, this is just figuring out the minimum TBW that you need. If yours is not enough, if you're plotting 600 or 60 terabytes, well, you're going to want to find something more than 600, like the Samsung 970 EVO, or else you'll have to buy multiple of these. Okay, so now that we have the capacity figured out, so for me, since I'm going to be plotting less than 37, this one works for me. However, you need to calculate on yours. So now we need to look at form factor. Now, form factor is basically the slot that these SSDs go in. Now, I listed out 2. I listed out the 2.5-inch SATA and the M.2. Now, if you look on this page, you'll see that there's actually quite a few form factors I didn't list, the U.2 and the AIC. Now, the AIC basically goes into your PCIe slot, like where your graphics card would go. The only problem with these is I find that they're a lot more expensive than the U.2. Now, what's the problem with U.2? Well, U.2 is for enterprise use, usually. So your motherboard probably most definitely does not have a U.2 slot. So if you never heard of U.2 form factor, then it's probably best to stay away from it, in my opinion, unless you kind of want to experiment and maybe buy an adapter that I think goes into your PCIe slot. But if you're just looking for an easy way to get into plotting, I would just avoid these enterprise form factors, to be honest. Now, what does that leave us? Well, that leaves us with SATA 2.5-inch. Now, what's the problem with SATA? 2.5 inch. Well, the problem with this form factor is it has a bottleneck on the speed, so it maxes out about 600 megabytes per second. In real world, it's about 550. So it really, if your plan is to plot as fast as you can, well, you don't want to get a bottleneck on the form factor. So where does that leave us? Well, if your motherboard is capable and has an M.2, well, that's what you want to go for. So how do you figure out if your motherboard has an M.2 slot? Well, again, go to System Information. Look up your baseboard product, your manufacturer. Type this into Google, and try to get the spec sheet. Now, what you want to look for, so this is my motherboard. I have a C390 Pro 4. Now, what you want to look for, so mine has 6 SATA, and mine has 2 Ultra M.2s. Now, the PCIe generations, so mine's Gen 3 times 4, these are forward and backward compatible. But we'll also, go over this when we review the 970 Pro and the 980 Pro Samsung SSDs. Now, M.2, it supports NVMe and SATA 3. Now, SATA has that limit that I talked about, the 600 megabytes. So you want to avoid a SATA M.2 SSD, and I'll show you the difference of them. In fact, I think I have it up right here. So this is a SATA, so the little notch is on the left side, and normally they have 2 notches. And then the right side has, and this is the NVMe, and the notch is on the right side. And these are the 2 M.2 slots. So if yours is on the right side, then that's an NVMe, and that's good. All right. So now that we've talked about form factor, and you probably figured out that you're probably going to need an M.2, if possible. Now, if you're using a laptop, that might not be possible. So you might have to just settle with SATA and plug it in via USB. I think you can do a Thunderbolt to NVMe, but that's beyond this video. So the next thing that you want to look at is interface. So SATA and NVMe. Now, interface is basically how the SSD talks to the protocol that is used to talk to the computer. NVMe is so much faster than SATA, so this is why you want to do NVMe M.2 if possible. So again, you have to look at your form factor to see if your motherboard supports NVMe. So if it has this slot right here, then it supports NVMe. If it only has this slot, then it doesn't. And again, look at your motherboard. So it says PCIe Gen 3 or Gen 4 or whatever, then it supports NVMe. Okay. So now that we have the bulk of the questions kind of answered, let's talk about speed. Now this is when it gets kind of complicated. Now this is where it gets kind of confusing because there's different ways that SSDs are made, and this affects how they perform both short, and bursty performance and long writing performance. So there's actually SLC, MLC, TLC, and QLC. Now what does this stand for? Well, this stands for multi-level cells, triple-level cells, and quad-level cells. Now if you see anything with QLC, just don't buy it. It's not for Chia. Don't, just for any reason. I don't care how cheap it is, just don't get it. Now for MLC, this is mainly for enterprise, and same with SLC, which I didn't list here, that's for enterprise. Now TLC and QLC, that's for consumer. Why? Well, these are cheaper to produce, and you get a larger amount of space with them. So these are, ideal for consumers who don't normally write 24/7 to their drives. Whereas MLC, they have longer endurance, and they can write for longer periods of time. Now, let's go back to the SSD endurance page. And this is where it gets a little bit complicated, because remember I got the Samsung Evo, right? Because it was enough endurance for me. It was 600 terabytes written, and that's what I needed. However, this is where you run into a catch, basically. So consumer SSDs are just not recommended because of low endurance, but also because they employ caching algorithms. And it might be fast, in the short term. So if you're copying over 1 gigabyte worth of data, it'll do that probably just as good as an enterprise version. However, that's not what we're doing when we're plotting with Chia. We're writing 1.6 terabytes, and we're doing it one after the other. So it just doesn't work well for consumer SSDs. Now, with that being said, there is a single consumer SSD that I want to talk about, and that is the Samsung 970 Pro. Now this SSD actually employs MLC, which is generally for enterprise SSDs. And not only that, it has a 1200 terabytes written endurance. So you can write about 75 terabytes worth of plots with this, which is great. And this seems a bit overestimated. I found it on Amazon for $250. Now, there is a 980 Pro, and I would not suggest buying the 980 Pro, even though it's cheaper on Amazon at $200, and I'll go over why. So first, I'm a visual guy, so let's go over this one more time, but with graphs. So if we're looking at a graph here, these are all the QLCs and TLCs, and here we can see the 980 Pro right here. And you can see that they have those great write times. This is sustained write time, so it's just keep writing nonstop. And you can see that they start off good, but then they just have this cliff where they just plummet, and they stay down there because they're running out of this cache that they create to write fast in that little burst of time. Now let's go ahead and go to a different graph here, and I'll link these in the description below. And here again we can see that this rocket, this is actually has great endurance as well, and it starts off great, but then it just plummets down as well. However, if you look at the Samsung 970 Pro, you can see that it doesn't drop at all. This is because it doesn't have a caching algorithm. It's just using the MLC in it. And again, the Intel Optane, now I haven't looked into this, but it looks like it does pretty good. So, let's actually look at the spec sheet for the 970 Pro and the 980 Pro. So if I go here, we can look at the 970 Pro. And here again, we can see that the 1 terabyte SSD has 1200 worth of writing, which is great. And we can also see right here that it's a 2-bit MLC, which is what gives it that sustained performance and the long endurance. Now let's go look at the 980 Pro spec sheet. So this is the 980 Pro right here. And then we can see that it says 3-bit, but it says MLC. Just ignore whatever Samsung says right here. This is just TLC. There is no such thing as 3-bit MLC. This is just marketing. So it's 3-bit MLC. So this is why, it has that great performance at first, but then it just drops down. Also, because it's 3-bit MLC, it has lower endurance. So if we look at the same size, the 1 terabyte, it only has 600 terabytes. So you might be only paying $200 for this versus $250 for the 970, but you're getting half the writes, for its lifetime. So the 980 Pro is just not worth it for Chia. Do not buy the 980 Pro for Chia plotting. I'm just telling you right now. Now, there is a nice little graph right here just to go over, and I'll link this in the description. So basically, like I said, higher performance and endurance with the, SLC, MLC, and then this is higher density, so larger capacity and lower costs, but lower performance and lower endurance. And so QLC is not even on here, but it would be right here. Okay, so now that we've covered all that, let's just quickly go over or recap of the things that we need to consider. So capacity. And how do you figure out capacity? Well, you look at your CPU and your RAM, and you figure out your bottleneck, and then from there you can calculate, what size SSD you want. Endurance. Basically, how big is your farm going to be? If you're plotting 35 terabytes, well, you might need only a 600 terabyte written endurance. Now, you might have to start searching for spec sheets if it's not listed. Sometimes they hide it. But generally speaking, if it's TLC or QLC, 600 is probably going to be the number, or right around there. If it's MLC and SLC, it's going to be a lot higher. Form factor, you got to look at your motherboard, either physically or go to the spec sheet. Do you only have SATA drives, or do you have M.2? If you have M.2, choose the M.2 so you can get the NVMe. Now, interface, so are you going to do NVMe or SATA? Now, just don't do SATA if you have the NVMe. So if you have that slot that we talked about, If you have this slot right here, do NVMe. Now, if you have this slot right here, you just don't have that capability. Now, at this point, I would like just to quickly go over another reason why you don't want to get the 980 Pro, and that is, so the 980 Pro, one of the reasons why it has just such insane speeds for short periods of times is because it is Gen 4 PCIe, so my motherboard is Gen 3. So even if I got that, I'll be stuck with Gen 3 speeds. So I wouldn't even get that bonus speed for that short period of time. And unless you have a newer motherboard, you probably don't either. So I just wouldn't go for it. Okay, so I got sidetracked again. So for speed, again, I would go with the Pro for the MLC because, like we saw in that graph, it's just steady writes. TLC and QLC, they're just going to slow down eventually. They're going to have that cliff. So I hope this video kind of helped clear some things up. Now, if you do want to go with enterprise versions, I would suggest reading up on it on your own, and then definitely reading this. If you want to do enterprise, read this, and this should help you. But I just don't have the capability or the knowledge to really help people, work with U.2s or setting up RAIDs and stuff like that. But I did want to give people, average farmers like me, just some resource to kind of, go down the rabbit hole and figure out what's the best one for me. So I hope this video was helpful. If you have any recommendations that you found a good deal on, go ahead and leave those in the comments. But this is just my little journey of picking out SSD. So until next time, bye. Oh, one last thing. So I didn't realize it, but on my motherboard, like my M.2 slots are actually shared with a couple of my SATA slots. So when I plugged in my my Evo M.2, a couple of my SATA slots actually disappeared, and my machine wouldn't boot up because my SSD for my operating system wasn't showing up. So you kind of have to look at that. Look at your motherboard specs on that too. It's kind of disappointing, but it scared me at first, so I figured I would share that as well. Anyways, bye.